Welcome again, everybody. I'm Brian O'Leary, Executive Director of the Book Industry Study Group, and I'm happy to welcome you to today's webinar, Thema for the U.S. Market, What Publishers and Others Should Know. It's going to be presented by Chris Saynor, who's the Standards Editor for EDItEUR. He's also a good friend of BISG and a regular participant in our committee meetings, including the Metadata Committee. Chris has responsibility for updating the Thema standard and oversees the International Steering Committee meetings that take place at London and Frankfurt book fairs, as well as online each year. Before we begin, we wanted to let you know that we are reserving time for questions at the end. Chris will be happy to answer any that you might have. The best place to put them is in the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your navigation bar. We'll also be monitoring them throughout and then rounding them up and asking them at the end. So Chris, if I could, I'll turn it over to you. I know you've put together a lot of material and we really appreciate you making the time to be with us today.
Thank you very much, Brian, and welcome everyone to this BISG coffee break, where I'm going to be talking to you about Thema. I'm going to try and give you a few reasons why you may want to use Thema in the US market, brief overview of the structure of Thema, and a few examples to show you how it works. Before I get going, I am going to be using some book covers and showing some examples, but I wanted to emphasize that it's me who's chosen those subject codes. They do not necessarily reflect what the publisher themselves would have chosen. So any mistakes are my own. So first thing I want to say is this talk is not about replacing BISAC codes. This talk is very much about using Thema along with BISAC codes. So also, this is not just about the US market, it's about the rest of the world as well. We're trying to think about the total addressable market of a title. Thema is an international multilingual book subject classification scheme. It's been designed to work for the whole book supply chain, be that the domestic one or the international one. It works for online retailers or in-person booksellers. It's for publishers, it's for distributors, data aggregators, for physical or digital publications, audiobooks. It works for general trade, children's, for K-12, for STM publishers, comic book publishers across the industry. And Thema is also something that's been created and is maintained and updated by users across the globe and in different sections of the book industry. And it was designed to meet real problems and needs in the book industry. And before we get going, for those of you who may not yet be aware of this and are still sending the old BIC subject categories to partners maybe in the UK or Australia and New Zealand, these have not been updated since 2010, have effectively been frozen. And from February next year, 2024, they will become officially obsolete. So official support for those will be withdrawn. So if you're still sending bit codes, look at moving to Thema as well. So why use Thema as well as BISAC? We'll come back to one of the main important things. It's the international and multilingual nature of the book industry. In the US, you supply books to the US market, but you're also supplying books, whether you do it on purpose or just through the fact that they're searchable on the internet, to the whole world. The book industry is multilingual. There are over 54 million people in the US apparently who speak Spanish as a first language. So it's a huge market. It's also about taking ownership and responsibility for your metadata from a global perspective. If you're the person, if you're the organization, the publisher that creates the metadata, you should be creating that metadata for the whole of the publishing, the book supply chain, and from a global perspective. And from subject classification, it's a good idea to put your BISAC codes in, but also add your Thema codes. Because using a global standard like Thema helps to clearly communicate across the supply chain information about your titles. So you're making your metadata more inclusive you're allowing it to be your books to be more discoverable around the world. It also makes it easier for retailers, especially those retailers who work in multiple markets, getting titles from multiple suppliers around the globe, or dealing with multiple languages when they have a standardized classification scheme. Thema is relatively simple to use. It's a list of subject codes, so a beginner can understand Thema quite quickly. But also Thema is very flexible. It's built on principles of post-coordination, which I'll explain in a bit. It allows for the mixing of subject codes, and it has qualifiers. This flexibility effectively greatly increases the choice of topics. It means that there's far more choice for discoverability, for shelving decisions, for display decisions in the supply chain. It's been optimized for faceted and filtered searches, and it can enhance the discoverability of things like the qualifiers can enhance the discoverability of things like the diversity, equity, and inclusive content. So, an overview of the structure of Thema for those who are not familiar with it. So there are roughly 3,000 core subject categories. These are arranged hierarchically in 20 main sections, and they have a variable depth of hierarchy. So these are the top levels of those subjects. As you can see, they're very broad. These are designed to build hierarchies of. A publisher would not use these to classify books. A retailer who, let's say, has a very small medicine section may use the top level to display books, but you wouldn't use these to classify. And variable depth. So you have something like historical fiction. It only goes to a second level. There's no need for further detail. Further detail is provided by using qualifiers. Other sections go down to 6. So in the subject codes, this is the deepest you can go at the moment, to level 6, but there's a variation in the depth according to the needs in each section. Thema also has qualifiers. Qualifiers are an incredibly important part of Thema. So there's about 1,000 core or shared qualifiers, and these are them. So you have place qualifiers. So place qualifiers are used to say this book is about this place, or the action of this novel is set here. So for example, I got a cookery book, or New York cookery book, or fashion in Brooklyn, or a novel that takes place in New York City. That's what the place qualifiers are for. Language, we have a whole set of language qualifiers so this is when books are about a language. So for learning a language, examining the history of languages, linguistics, etc. Not used to say what language the book is published in. It's what the book is about. Time periods. So this is to allow you to say, this is a history of the 1870s. This is the history of New York in the 1870s, for example, or this is a book that is set in the 1870s. Educational qualifiers. This book is for primary education, it's for adult education, it's for vocational education, specifically for the curriculum of Brazil. It's for that kind of thing. The 5s, interest qualifiers, there's a lot of detail in here. I'm going to show you a few of these in the examples, but this is one where it's especially when you're looking at ways of highlighting DEI content, there's some very interesting qualifiers here. And then finally, the style qualifiers, they start with 6, and they're to be used mostly with the arts. So you can say this is a book about Renaissance art, about Renaissance music, about Renaissance architecture, about Renaissance theatre, etc. So it gives us the flexibility to have those multiple sections in the arts. Thema also has what we call national extensions within the qualifiers. And so like other qualifiers, these are mixed with the subject codes, and they look like this. The vast majority of those national extensions are in the place qualifiers because that's where we need the most detail. They're usually constructed, you can recognize them because there's a hyphen and then a 2-letter code that can either represent the country who suggested it, or when we're talking about geography, gives an indication of the geography. As they're structured and hierarchical, in this example, the publisher of this book would choose the most detailed code. They would choose the code for Yosemite. But a retailer might say, I don't need that level of detail. So if you're a retailer outside the United States, you might say, okay, I don't need that level of detail. Maybe I'll just put it in my California section or in my US section, so you can take the hierarchy back up. But the person who's choosing those codes will always choose the most relevant one. If I change the title and have one that's about California, even if this book has a section on Sequoia and Kings Canyon, I'm not going to choose that code. I'm going to choose the California one because it's the most relevant. Those categories, subject categories and qualifiers all have language independent code, and it's that code that you would use in machine-to-machine communication. So for example, in an ONIX farm, it's those codes that are sent. They also have a heading and a note. Those headings and notes exist in English, but also can be translated into multiple languages. There are 25 language translations that exist at the moment, official translations. And what does that mean? Well, that means, so we take this book, originally published in Japanese, we have the same codes for the English language version and for the Spanish language version. So as you can see, the codes remain the same. It's just the text that is presented, changes languages, which makes it easier for us as humans. Those codes, if you were selling the Japanese version on an English language site or a Spanish language site, you can use the same codes for the titles. Or if you are selling the US edition, still remains the same codes. So I mentioned post-coordination. So there are two ways of creating subject classifications, pre-coordinated and post-coordinated. So the BISAC codes that you're familiar with are pre-coordinated. Thema is post-coordinated. They both have their own merits. So if you look at this example, I'm going to give you a couple of travel guides because it's the easiest to show. The decision to say TRV 014000 equals travel Mexico has already been made. That code means that you can send a second BISAC code. You could say food, lodging, transportation, hotels and inns as another BISAC code. So that would mean the book could sit on the Mexico shelf or on the hotel shelf. Thema also has predefined, the codes have predefined meanings. WTH means travel guides. On KLCM, MXFA means Mexico City. But there isn't a single subject code that says travel guides to Mexico City. You need two codes to create that meaning. That's what post-coordination is. So it gives a greater flexibility. Give you another example. The BISAC codes pre-coordinated, designed for use in the US, designed for use in the US bookstores, and it makes perfect sense. You wouldn't need any greater detail than this in a bookshop. But by also sending the Thema codes, we have the detail that it's about Nigeria. That code will be inside a structure, so somebody could use it to link the other books about Nigeria. Give you a final example. So we take this guide, Bhutan. Well, we can take this principle. I've got books on Bhutan. So if I can link that to other books about Bhutan, so what history? History is another good example in Thema of where that post-coordination with qualifiers is really important. We have broad history categories, Asian history, but you can mix that with any place qualifier and any time period qualifier to create a vast range of different topics. Another aspect of Thema that's really important is this ability to mix codes and to use qualifiers. So here I've got a children's picture book. It's a storybook. So I have two codes that indicate that it's fiction, the stories, but I've mixed that with a non-fiction code because the main theme of this story is celebrations. And those celebrations I've detailed by using qualifiers. It's about Ramadan and it's about Rosh Hashanah. But I've also told people that this is a work of fiction by using a notion called main subject in ONIX, or if you're sending it in Excel or some other way, you'd say, this is my principal subject. It's a work of fiction. That relationship between codes and qualifiers is very important. So we have a whole set of qualifiers that indicate that the book is about one of the stages of life. Like LKS is about, when it's about later life, they try to hold old age, being a senior. And that qualifier does not qualify a particular subject, it qualifies the whole thing. There's no grammar, there's no this one goes with this one. So 5LKS works with any of these subject codes, although we probably could say for two of them, there's a greater affinity because we're talking about the psychology of aging and we're talking about child, developmental and lifespan psychology. So having that relating to late adulthood code gives greater meaning, especially to those two. We look at this book, we also have another generational, another stage of life code relating to the teenage years to adolescence. That means that this book deals with that as a topic. It doesn't mean that's necessarily the audience because it could be an academic study. We have something else, 5AQ, which gives meaning to the Y codes. So the 5AQ is what tells us this is teenage fiction, or probably more common in the US, you'd probably say young adult fiction. We don't use that term in Thema because it's something that changes meaning or doesn't mean anything in different cultures. So we just use the age for that. Got various things going on here. We have other qualifiers that say that one of the main characters identifies as trans, the other one identifies as gay. So we could possibly, a retailer receive this information, could put it in their YA LGBTQ plus fiction section. Or because we've identified the main subject of this as being romance and love stories, maybe they'll put it in the YA LGBT romance section. It takes place in Los Angeles. That gives an opportunity for somebody who's trying to create a section about, I'm looking for books that take place in Los Angeles. I'm doing a promotion about ghost stories that are set in Los Angeles. We have that information. A bookstore in Los Angeles will be able to create a local interest section using that. Oops, sorry, the two non-fiction codes that sent with it, one about gender identity, one about self-awareness. We could use those as filters. A retailer could use that to create a fiction section about self-esteem. We've said that the main characters, both the main characters are of Latin heritage. So a retailer could create a Latinx love stories section. We've also used one of the holiday codes because this book takes place on the Day of the Dead, and it's an important aspect of the story. So we have that. So what we're doing with Thema is giving a lot of information that gives people choices, different ways, different pathways to discover titles, and retailers different options to create book sections. So we could create a promotion around books, the Day of the Dead, or Libros para el Día de Muertos, because Spanish is another major language for the United States. And we can use that to link us to other books. We can find other things. Okay, looking for children's books about the Day of the Dead. Or maybe it'll take us elsewhere, take us into fiction. This book takes place on one single Day of the Dead in 1939. So we have another book about the Day of the Dead. But this one takes place in Mexico, in the state of Morelos. So it gives people a chance to look for books, novels that are set in Mexico in the 1930s, because we're using a place qualifier and a time period qualifier. We've also used a non-fiction code with fiction codes, so it gives you a chance to look for fiction about alcoholism. That's what you want. This is another example. We're mixing fiction and non-fiction codes to give greater meaning. So you put it in two fiction sections, give it a narrative theme. Narrative themes are another aspect of Thema. But we've also used a non-fiction code to say that one of the major themes of this book is indigenous sacred traditions. And we've qualified that by saying it takes place in Mexico. But we also have place qualifiers for historical cultural places. So this deals with the Mayan gods. We can use that. We also have the time period because this takes place during the Jazz Age. Oops. Something that we've done that's available to everybody is we've created 6 golden rules of Thema classification. These are guidelines, they aren't rules. There isn't a Thema police yet. And so these are available on the site, and they just give it, they're there to help people when they're starting to learn how to do classification. They're very simple. Make sure that one of your codes is always chosen as the main one, the primary one. Classify titles as precisely as applicable or as broadly as required. So you choose the right level in the hierarchy that makes sense to you. Assign as many categories as required within reason, from the subject categories and from the qualifiers. Add the qualifiers wherever appropriate. They are really powerful in certain sections. In other areas, you don't need them so much. They're not so useful in medicine, but they're incredibly powerful in history, with fiction, etc. It's really important to look at the scope notes and instructions, go with the categories, and also to look at the context, to be aware of where the code is within the hierarchy. And then if you want to know more, there's a lot of further resources. We've got a lot of information on our website. There are some videos that we've done with other organizations. All of those are available. There's a whole series of documents that are very easy to read, very accessible on our website that cover different aspects. So basic introductions to Thema, do more specific topics like diversity, equity, and inclusion, how to use main subject, mixing codes, many codes. All those are available on the site. You can also find all the different language translations. So if you want to use one of the language translations, they're all available in 4 formats: Excel, HTML, JSON, and XML. And there's the Thema browser as well, which is a really useful tool. There's a lot of search possibilities with that. And that's it. That's my very brief overview of Thema. And over to you if you have questions.
Like we have dueling Saynors here. Thank you, Chris, very much for doing that, for doing this presentation. We do have some questions, but if you have one of your own, please add it to the Q&A chat, and we'll pick it up before we let Chris go. One of the first questions that came in is actually a practical one that we hear about for BISAC as well. So Marian's asking, if a publisher tags a book with certain Thema codes, but the retailer wants to categorize them differently, how does this work with respect to ONIX feeds that could potentially overwrite the changes the retailer made to its classification?
So first thing, the retailer has the choice of how they categorize any book. What you're doing when you are a publisher, you're giving them a maximum amount of information so they can make choices. But we can't impose that choice on them. That's why I was using those different examples of what a retailer could do with the books. Most retailers will map from Thema or BISAC or both to their own. Most retailers have their own subject categories. If they make that choice to override it, that's their choice. If they're getting updates in the ONIX feed, then they have to be aware that that might change what they do. So they have to build in a process to make sure that they can double check that. I mean, from what I know, retailers now either directly display the codes or use their own mapping. So if they get that same, they'll have mapped, say, from, I see this code and this code, so I'm always going to map it to that. So even if you put that in your ONIX, it should still go to what they have decided in their own shop. I hope that makes sense, Marion.
Thank you, Chris. Kathy's asking a question that maybe the two of us can take a shot at answering. She's asking, what is the benefit of maintaining BISAC when Thema is so much more powerful, precise, and useful? And she makes the parenthetical observation that BISAC is thoroughly embedded in the North American book marketplace. But what's your perspective on essentially maintaining the two standards?
So as I said right at the beginning, I'm not talking about replacing BISAC. The BISAC codes are deeply ingrained in the United States in the book supply chain. They're used by a lot of people there. So it's not something that can be removed like that. A lot of people have built their systems around it. It's used. So I think it's important to carry on using those. What I also think is important is to use natively start adding your Thema codes, so that for those that are using Thema outside the US, or some people who want to make extra use of it, because that's the other thing you can do with Thema within the US, you're getting a bit of extra information as well that gives you different choices. So I think it's important to use both. I mean, publishers in other countries who supply to the US, that's what they have to do. They do Thema, and they usually have to add in the BISAC codes as well, because they work with a lot of people in the United States. So I think that it's important to do both. Brian, have you got?
Thanks. Yeah, I would add that first we're working together. So we map BISAC to Thema and provide that information to the editor, shares it with the Thema community. I think the advantage for BISAC, in addition to its longevity, it goes back to the mid-1990s, is that it has been built for the North American marketplace, particularly the United States, but also with Canada in mind. And it's maintained with that focus. I think Thema has come along really well in the last 10 years, and it will be celebrating its 10th anniversary, I think, in Frankfurt in the fall. So that's a good piece of it. But I think it is currently, BISAC is currently the preference particularly for retailers and data collectors like NTD Bookscan in the US market. The question from Catherine asking, can you mix children and adult subject codes?
Theoretically, yes, but we don't recommend it. There's a recently published paper on mixing codes, so we try to illustrate when that makes sense. There's within the notes for the children's section, there are ones that say it makes sense. The basic rule is, would this cause any harm if it goes in the wrong section? So, for example, sports for adults has far more detail than sports for children, and I often use the example of Gaelic football. We have an adult code for that, but we don't have a children's code. But it probably wouldn't matter if the wrong book went in the wrong section. But another thing, we say avoid using the fiction and the children's teenage fiction together, because that gets too much of a mixed message. Because fiction content is usually written for a particular audience. So the Thema allows the mixing of codes, but we say use that with caution, and I've definitely tried to outline that in more detail in that mixing Thema codes document.
Thanks. And I think that you also have the ability to mix fiction and nonfiction, which is something that BISAC we strongly argue against. So there are some differences between implementations of the two standards. Marianne was also asking where in ONIX do you embed the Thema codes? And I think it's the same section that you would add BISAC. Is that correct? Absolutely.
It's the same subject composite. It's just there's a change of code from list 27. So it's 93 for subject code, for Thema subject, 94 for place qualifiers, 95 for, and so on. That's
the difference. So you're providing, and you have to provide that granularity at the level of each book. Jessica's asking if you could name some retailers that are using Thema on their sites now that they could look at, and I think certainly Amazon Europe is one of them, is it not?
Amazon Global. So all the Amazons, because there's a single team that does the book price tree, use Thema and BISAC. On physical books, definitely, and gradually moving with the two other silos for the audio and then for the digital. Kobo, when there's a Thema, when there are Thema things that will be displayed directly on the website. Storytel uses it. Blackwell's in the UK uses it. There are various sites that do use it. Unfortunately, like with ONIX, we don't always know who's actually using it. It's only when somebody points it out.
Right. And I think that you didn't, I mean, the purpose of this presentation was really a how-to around Thema, but I wanted to just do a little bit of a shout out for the information that you shared at the most recent steering committee meeting. I believe there are, the Thema code list has been translated into 24 languages. And and it's in use in, is it 50 different countries?
That we are aware of, yes.
Yeah, so it has fairly wide uptake outside of the North American market.
But for example, we had a question from Trinidad and Tobago about use of Thema. So like, oh, right, somebody's using it there.
Rick is asking if there are qualifiers that specifically address audiobooks. I think it's really focused on content, is it?
It's focused on content. You can use the qualifiers with any style of book. There are two. I know there are there are a couple of subject categories that work best with audiobooks because they're about sound. But the fact that it's an audiobook is usually addressed in ONIX or equivalent. There is a category for practical books about creating audio, but not this is an audiobook because that's formal.
I apologize if I mispronounced your name, but Biljana is asking if there's an algorithm to create Thema codes from BISAC. There is not, but we do map from BISAC to Thema. It's useful for backlists, but we always encourage anyone who uses that to take a look at it and make sure that it makes sense for the title in hand. Is that your sense, Chris, as well?
Yes. If you as an organization have licensed the BISAC codes, it'll be in the pack you get that you can download from the BISG website. There's a mapping. There's also a version available on our website, which is stripped out the literals that does that mapping. I would encourage you to do the mapping just as an initial process and not to rely on it because they're different schemes and you lose out on the richness that you can get with either BISAC or Thema if you rely on mappings. So I think it's important that you get into the habit when you go forward of adding them natively.
So Kirk is making both an observation. He says the Thema solves so many of the problems within BISACs, and I think we probably have to parse that a little bit to understand what the problems might be. And he mentions that somebody from Lancia has spoken of how well it works for them. But his specific question for you is what % of US publishers are currently using Thema? And I think that we probably don't know that answer, but it's anyone, you would recommend that anyone with a global distribution of it or pursuing global sales of a title should be thinking about BISAC plus Thema.
Yep. I'm afraid I don't have that kind of information. You'd need somebody who had a vision on more US data to know that, somebody like Ingram's or Bauker's. But I do encourage, we did have a question only yesterday from somebody in New Zealand saying, we get lots of information from US publishers, but they don't put Thema in, so they were asking about how they could get Thema to the US titles by using a mapping, which comes back to one of the problems. If you don't put that in, then they use mappings to try and add codes so that they appear on their own sites. But you're going to be losing some of the richness and detail because you'll get category drift or misclassification.
Agreed. And you mentioned during the course of your presentation that BIC, the standard for the UK had been essentially hasn't been updated in 13 years and will be obsoleted next February. This is really the time for anyone who's providing BIC codes for their titles, either historically or currently, to stop doing that and replace them with Thema. Would you agree?
Yes. I definitely would agree. If you've got anybody who's still asking you for BIC, move to Thema, send them Thema. There's mappings that Nielsen have provided that are available on our website that map backwards from Thema to BIC for any legacy data, but definitely concentrate on BISAC and Thema. Because the UK market's definitely moved to Thema.
Agreed. And I think that's a good implementation. I just want to throw in quickly that Kirk added that he thought that the areas where BISAC might be lacking included DEI and language details. And I think you've given some good examples of the flexibility that the qualifiers add to the subject codes within Thema.
Because Thema has that flexibility, because it's post-coordinated, we can say here's a code, and you can send them both and somebody can put them together or not. BISAC, somebody has to make a choice about creating a shelf label, as it were. So.
Agreed. And they serve different purposes
Yes.
in that regard. Millie was asking if is the advice to use, and I'm going to read this, the most specific code versus global, or is the global included in the specific code? Do you need them to be separate or to provide them together? And I think the answer is probably the same for BISAC, but why don't you talk about Thema?
Both BISAC and Thema are hierarchical systems, so the code that is a parent or a grandparent is implicit in the code. So when you're classifying, always use the most precise, the most applicable one, wherever that is in the hierarchy. You do not need to include the global one as well, because that's part of the code structure.
And that would be true both for the code as well as any qualifiers, that you use the most specific qualifier that applies. Or I know we're a little bit over time, but I just wanted to ask you one more question. Are there any AI tools for adding categories for backlists that you're aware of? This is from Thomas.
Somebody posted on LinkedIn that they'd done an experiment on Spanish language books with chat GPT, the chat, AI, and they got subjects, but and they got quite interesting results, but they then went back and manually sorted, but it didn't give them any qualifiers. So people are experimenting. But again, to do that, it did that by just with the metadata, not with access to the content.
I think one thing I would say is that neither BISG nor EDItEUR has developed a tool like that just yet, but it may be worth talking, particularly if you use a provider title management or similar metadata management software, to check with your provider to see if they're thinking about it or can provide tools in that regard. And Chris, is that a replacement URL for that?
Yeah.
Thank you for sending that.
So I saw there was somebody said that the URL for YouTube, it's on our website as well. It links to it. Or if you search Big Brunch's Thema sessions, it comes up in YouTube. So somebody pointed out my URL no longer works.
Great. Yeah, I was going to just draw you into that conversation at the end. I didn't want to distract you, but Brad, there's a substitute link in the chat if you want to try and pick that up. Chris, sure. any last, we don't have any more questions, but any last thoughts as you want people to be thinking more globally about the use of Thema? Yeah,
don't just think about US people who are already using BISAC. Think about the rest of the world. We all search for books, and the US market, the US publishing sector is huge. A lot of the books that we find come from the US. So it's very good to think about your global metadata.
Well, thank you for making the time today. It's always good to see you. We're fortunate to be able to have you and Graham Bell participate in our metadata meetings every month, but also to be able to spend time with you in London and Frankfurt talking about the details of ONIX and Thema. It's great to have your perspective on this. I look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure as always, Brian. And thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.